is a way of communication. It is a tool for uniting and dividing people. Language allows people to share. Language changes, dies, and it's not passive. For today's video of learning, we're going to talk about the varieties of language. For today's learning, as we are going to talk about language variation, it covers all the contents of a standard language: the national language, the dialect, which has 4 varieties: the regional level, minority level, social level, and individual level. Register: Pidgin, Creole, classical language, lingua franca, diglosia, and style. The term linguistic variation, or simply the variation of language, refers to regional, social, or contextual differences in the ways that a particular language is used. All aspects of language, phonemes, morphemes, syntactic structures, and meanings are subject of variation. A variation between language, dialects, and speakers is known as interspeaker variation, and variation between the language of a single speaker is called the intra-speaker variation. A variation in language used among speakers or the group of speakers is a notable criterion or change that may occur in pronunciation or the accent, the word choices or the lexicon, or even preferences for particular grammatical patterns. Variation is a principal concern in social linguistics. It has been discovered that variation is typically the vehicle of language change. Without any further ado, let us now first discuss the standard language. Standard language is a variety of language that is used by government, in media, in school, and for international communication. There are different varieties of English in the world, such as North American English, Australian English, and Indian English. Although these varieties differ in the terms of their pronunciation, there are few differences in grammar between them. In contrast, there are non-standard forms of language that are used, for example, in different regional dialects, and in these non-standard varieties of language are different from each other. The only difference between standard and non-standard language is that we considered that language is standard, which is right according to our own value of judgment. Well, standard language creates a harmony among people. It differs from person to person, area to area, and from country to country. Language changes after every 10 lines. Language is binary. It can combine or divide people. Language and ideology are interrelated. Standard language makes a country strong. To make a standard language, planning and policies are made. These policies are made by elite class. Language planning and language policies depend upon ideology. And standardization is a historical process which is always in progress. And standard as abstract norms to which actual usage more or less conforms. Lastly, standardization occurs in spelling, pronunciation, word meaning, word forms, sentence structures, and convention. Second to discuss is about national language or the official language. National or official language is the language of a country, recognized and adopted by its government and spoken and written by majority of people in a country. National language may, for instances, represent a national identity or a nation country. It brings people of a nation together and creates a sense of brotherhood and patriotism. For example, the official language of the Philippines is Filipino, a standardized form of Tagalog language, and Filipinos spoken by a majority of population, while English is also widely spoken and is the medium of instruction in school. Other languages spoken in Philippines include Tagalog, Cebuano, Ilocano, Hiligaynon, Waray-Waray, Bilocano, and Pangasinan. Third to discuss is about dialect. A dialect is a variation in grammar and vocabulary in addition to sound variation. For example, if one person utters a sentence, John is a farmer, and another says the same thing except pronounce the word farmer as farmer, then the differences is one of the accent. But if one person says something like, you should not do that, and other says, you hadn't ought to do that, then this is a dialect differences between the variation is greater. The extent of dialect differences is a continuum. Some dialects are extremely different and others less so. Dialect is a complex concept. For a linguist, a dialect is a collection of attributes in phonetics, phonological, syntactic, morphological, and semantic that make one group of speakers noticeably different from another group of speaker or the same language. So, dialect is a variety related to user. It involves differences in pronunciation, vocabulary, and grammar. Furthermore, dialect varies at 4 levels. First is the regional dialect. A regional dialect is not a distinct language but a variety of language spoken in a particular area of a country. Some regional dialects have been given traditionally names which mark them out as being significantly different from standard varieties spoken in the same place. The regional dialect of English are British English, American English, Canadian English, and Australian English. Minority dialect. Sometimes, members of a particular minority ethnic group have their own variety which they use as a marker of their identity, usually alongside the standard variety. This is called a minority dialect. Examples are African American Vernacular English in the USA, London and Jamaican in Britain, and Aboriginal English in Australia. Third to discuss is about social dialect. Socialect or social dialect is associated with a particular class. A social dialect is specifically used by a particular group of people living in a society. And lastly is the individual dialect. Individual dialect is also known as idiolect. Idiolect is used by all individuals living in a society. All people of a country use this dialect in their speech. Every person has a different tone, accent, pronunciation, and it is called idiolect. Pidgin is another varieties of language. According to David Crystal, he defines Pidgin as a language with a markedly reduced grammatical structure, lexicon, and stylistic range formed by two mutually unintelligible speech communities. So, a Pidgin is a new language which develops in situation where speakers of different language need to communicate but don't share a common language. For example, I am a Filipino and I have to talk to an English American citizen. we have differences in terms of language use. So, Pidgin is going to and so the presence of Pidgin is going to undertake in our situation, since a new language is developed as we are a different speakers and we use a different language. Pidgin is going to undertake as the new language create. Thus, we need to communicate in each other, but we don't share a common language. On the other hand, let's talk about Creole. So what is Creole language? A Creole language is a language that forms as a blend of two or more languages. These types of language develop when people who speak different languages live in the same area. The most widely known Creole language in the world is Haitian Creole. Haitian Creole developed as a mixture of French language and the native African language of slaves whom the French brought to Haiti. Many people use the term Creole to refer Haitian Creole language. However, there are in fact many different Creole language throughout the world. A perfect example of Creole language in the Philippines is Chavacano, a Creole language of Spanish descent where Spanish words are heavily incorporated into the local grammar. Next to discuss is about lingua franca. Lingua franca defined as a language which is used habitually by people whose mother tongue are different in order to facilitate communication between. It may refer to a trade language, a contact language, and international language. It is a language which has developed in response to the need of the people being using two different languages in everyday communication. English is the world lingua franca followed by French. So, lingua francas may be spoken in different ways. They are not only spoken differently in different places, but individual speakers varied widely with their ability to use language. Well, also, lingua franca, also known as a bridge language, a common language, trade language, auxiliary language, vehicular language, or link language. A language that is systematically used to make communication possible between groups of people who do not share a native language or dialect. Lastly is the style. The term style refers to a language variety that is divided based on speech or speak situation into formal or informal style. One can speak very formally or very informally. Our choice of style is governed by circumstances. The level of formality depends on number of factors. All the kind of situation, the various social, age, and other differences that exist between the participants in a conversation. The particular task that is involved, example, writing or speaking. The emotional involvement of one or more participants. Variation is a characteristic of language. There is more than one way of saying the same thing. Speaker may vary pronunciation, word choice, or morphology and syntax. But while the diversity of variation is great, there seems to be the boundaries of variation. Language variation happens mostly because there is not a single way to say a thing in a language. However, the way in which a speaker or writer expresses ideas has to do with specific factors.